The trouble began on a crisp October morning, the kind where the air smells of damp leaves and the creek behind my house gurgles like it's sharing a secret. I'd lived on this 2-acre plot for 6 years, a quiet corner of the county where the only drama was the occasional raccoon raiding my compost. That changed when Karen Davis, my neighbor to the east, decided our property line was her personal playground. I first noticed the post while walking Pixel, my scruffy mutt with a knack for sniffing out trouble. 4 metal stakes driven deep stood along the boundary where my land met the creek easement, a shared strip giving me and 3 other neighbors access to the water. A roll of chain-link fencing leaned against Karen's oak tree, glinting in the sunlight. I frowned. The creek was my haven, where I'd sit with a coffee and watch dragonflies skim the surface. Karen's fence would cut that off. I checked my property records that evening, spreading the surveyor's map across my kitchen table. The easement was clear, a 15-foot corridor legally mine to access running parallel to the creek. Karen's stakes sat 2 feet over the line, squarely on my side. I sighed, hoping it was a mistake. Karen, though, wasn't the oops, my bad type. She moved in a year ago, all sharp smiles and HOA rulebooks, and had already lectured me about my beehives attracting pests. I'd ignored her then. This was different. The next morning, I knocked on her door, map and title in hand. Karen answered in a pressed blazer, her platinum blonde hair pulled tight. "What's this about?" she asked, eyeing Pixel like he'd tracked mud on her porch. "Your fence," I said, keeping my tone even. "It's on my land, blocking the easement. Here's the survey." She barely glanced at the map. "That creek's a liability. The HOA agrees we need to secure it. You'll get used to it." "The HOA can't override an easement," I said. "This is illegal. Move the posts or I'll have to escalate." Her eyes narrowed. "Escalate, good luck." She shut the door. I spent the afternoon drafting a letter, attaching copies of the survey and easement deed, and slid it into her mailbox. No response. By evening, 2 more stakes appeared, and a spool of wire suggested she wasn't slowing down. I called a lawyer friend, Elliot, who advised documenting everything. "Get photos," he said, "and don't touch her stuff, it'll weaken your case." The next day, I snapped pictures of the stakes, the wire, and the creek now half hidden behind Karen's oak. Pixel sniffed the posts, growling low. I was tempted to yank them out myself, but Elliot's warning held me back. Instead, I emailed the HOA board expecting backup. Their reply was a tepid, "We'll review the matter." Karen, I later learned, was tight with the board's treasurer, a guy named Chandler who nodded along at her liability spiel. 3 days later, with no progress, I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. Deputy Rogers, a lanky guy with a slow drawl, showed up an hour later. I walked him to the boundary, handing over my documents. He studied the survey, glanced at Karen's stakes, and nodded. "Clear as day," he said. "Let's talk to her." Karen was pruning roses when we approached. "Sheriff's here about your fence," I said, staying calm. Rogers held up the survey. "Ma'am, these posts are on their property. You'll need to move them." Karen's pruning shears froze mid-snip. "This is HOA business," she snapped. "That creek's a hazard. I'm protecting the neighborhood." Rogers didn't blink. "HOA doesn't trump property law. Move the posts or I'll cite you for trespass." He tipped his hat. "Have a pleasant day." I thought that was the end. Karen's face was a storm cloud, but she didn't argue. Rogers drove off, and I headed home, Pixel trotting beside me. The creek sparkled under the noon sun, still accessible for now. I should have known Karen wasn't one to let a loss slide. As I locked my gate, I caught her watching from her porch, phone pressed to her ear, her voice too low to hear. Something told me this was just the spark, and the fire was coming. 2 weeks after Deputy Rogers told Karen to pull her illegal fence posts, I came home to a scene that turned my stomach. My wooden fence, a sturdy cedar barrier I'd built myself, was sliced clean through in 3 places, the cuts precise, like someone had taken their time. Deep tire tracks scarred the muddy creek bank, and one of my beehives, a hive I'd tended for 3 seasons, lay smashed, its frame splintered, honey oozing into the grass. Worst of all, Pixel, my loyal mutt, was limping, a nail embedded in his paw from a board studded with rusty spikes half buried near the fence line. I rushed him to the vet, my hands shaking as I dialed. The vet extracted the nail, prescribed antibiotics, and warned me to watch for infection. "Keep him off that paw," she said. The bill was $280. The rage was priceless. I was done playing nice. Karen had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to let her trample my home without a fight. That night, I ordered 4 motion sensor cameras online, the kind that ping your phone with alerts every 10 seconds until you mute them. They'd arrive in 2 days. In the meantime, I called Elliot, my lawyer friend, who suggested a surveyor to lock down my property lines. "Make it ironclad," he said. I hired Nora Beltran, a licensed surveyor with a reputation for precision and a glare that could stop a bulldozer. She arrived the next morning, her truck loaded with gear. "Show me the damage," she said, boots crunching on the gravel. Nora surveyed the boundary in 3 hours, marking my property with fluorescent orange stakes and laminating placards that read, "Tampering with survey monuments is a crime, $5,000 fine or 7 years." She eyed the tire tracks and the nailboard, now bagged as evidence. "This wasn't random," she muttered, snapping photos. "Get those cameras up fast." I nodded, my jaw tight. The creek, once my sanctuary, felt like a war zone. The cameras arrived the next day. I mounted them strategically, one on the barn overlooking the creek, 2 along the fence line, and 1 near the beehive ruins. They were wired to my phone, their night vision sharp enough to catch a raccoon's whiskers. I tested them that evening, Pixel curled up beside me, his paw bandaged. The app pinged, showing a deer nibbling grass. Good, I thought, you're watching. At 1:13 a.m., my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Alerts flooded in, each with a live feed. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and opened the app. The barn camera showed 2 figures in hoodies creeping along the creek bank. One tall and lanky gripped bolt cutters, the other shorter with platinum blonde hair spilling from the hood, yanked Nora's stakes from the ground. They tossed them into the creek, the splash faint but clear. The lanky one turned, and moonlight caught his face. Chandler, the HOA's treasurer, a weaselly guy I'd seen at Karen's side during her creek liability rants. The blonde didn't need identifying. Karen's hair was unmistakable. I called Deputy Rogers at dawn, forwarding the footage. He arrived by 7 a.m., coffee in hand, and watched the video on my phone. "That's Chandler, all right," he said, recognizing him from a string of petty theft calls. "And that's your neighbor, got him cold." He radioed for a warrant, citing criminal mischief and trespassing. By 8:30, Rogers and 2 deputies knocked on Chandler's door. I watched from my porch, Pixel at my side. Body cam footage later showed Chandler in sagging pajama pants, claiming he'd been asleep all night. Rogers held up a still from my camera, Chandler mid-grimace, bolt cutters gleaming. Chandler went quiet. Karen's arrest was less dramatic, but just as satisfying. Rogers found Nora's stakes in her garage, stacked beside a can of neon green spray paint, the same shade defacing my no trespassing signs. A pile of Nora's laminated placards, torn in half, sat nearby. Karen insisted Chandler had stored tools there without her knowledge, but Rogers wasn't buying it. "You're on the tape, ma'am," he said, cuffing her. She made bond by noon, but Chandler, on probation for a 2021 check-kiting scam, wasn't so lucky. His no-bond hold kept him in county jail, pending a probation hearing. I stood by the creek that evening, Pixel hobbling beside me, and watched the water flow. The cameras blinked red in the dusk, silent sentinels. Karen and Chandler had underestimated me, but I wasn't done. The footage was just the start. Something told me the creek had more secrets to spill. With Karen out on bond and Chandler stewing in county jail, I thought the worst was behind me. The creek glistened under the November sun, and Pixel's paw was healing, though he still limped on our walks. But Karen's fence and the smashed beehive were just the tip of a deeper rot, and my lawyer, Elliot, was about to uncover it. "Let's follow the money," he said over coffee, his laptop open to the HOA's public filings. "That gate Karen put up wasn't cheap. Who paid for it?" Elliot subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, zeroing in on the $3,500 used to buy the unlawful gate blocking my creek access. The paper trail led to a cashier's check, signed by none other than Chandler, drawn from the HOA's reserve account. It was sloppy. Chandler hadn't even bothered to disguise it as a board-approved expense. Elliot grinned. "This is a crack. Let's pry it open." We dug deeper, and the crack became a chasm. Chandler, as the HOA's treasurer, had written checks totaling $46,900 over 2 years for grounds improvements that never materialized. Phantom landscaping contracts, non-existent sprinkler repairs, and a $12,000 consulting fee to a company that didn't exist. The gate was just the latest in his schemes. Worse, $8,000 of those funds had funneled into Karen's personal bank account, labeled as consulting services. She claimed to be advising the HOA on community safety, but her only project was bullying me over the creek. The HOA board, a mix of retirees and busy parents, was blindsided. They trusted Chandler's spreadsheets and Karen's charm, never suspecting their reserve fund was a piggy bank. At an emergency meeting, they voted unanimously to press charges against Chandler for embezzlement. Karen's name came up too, but her role was murkier. Her lawyer, James Hall, a $600 an hour shark, was already spinning her as a victim of Chandler's deceit. The board wasn't buying it, but they needed hard evidence. Enter Detective Miriam Page from the county's white-collar crime unit. She was a wiry woman with a knack for untangling financial webs. Page seized Chandler's home computer and external drives, uncovering a digital goldmine, forged receipts, fake meeting minutes, and a Word template for neon green approval stamps used on fraudulent invoices. One email chain between Chandler and Karen, dated 3 months before the fence dispute, discussed securing the creek for future development. Karen had written, "Handle the paperwork and I'll make sure you're taken care of." Page printed that email and pinned it to her case board. Chandler, facing felony theft charges on top of his probation violation, was desperate. His probation officer had already filed for revocation, which meant an automatic 18-month sentence for his 2021 check-kiting conviction. With Page piling on evidence, he cracked. In a plea deal, he agreed to testify against Karen, detailing how she'd pushed the land grab to annex my creek access for the HOA, promising him a cut of any future profits. It was a long shot. Annexation required my consent, but Karen's ego had blinded her to the legal hurdles. The HOA board, meanwhile, sent me a letter of apology signed by all 7 members. "We failed to oversee our treasurer," it read. "We're cooperating fully with the investigation." They also hired an auditor to claw back what they could from Chandler's accounts, which had been frozen pending the case. A small win came when the auditor recovered $4,500, enough to cover my beehive repairs and Pixel's vet bills. It wasn't justice, but it was a start. Karen, predictably, doubled down. Her lawyer filed motions to suppress my camera footage, claiming it violated her privacy. Elliot laughed when he read the filing. "She was trespassing on your land," he said. "The judge will toss this in 10 seconds. Sure enough, the motion was denied. Karen's next move was a public sob story, telling neighbors I was harassing her over a misunderstanding. A few bought it, but most had seen the tire tracks and my ruined fence. The creek didn't lie. As December rolled in, I stood by the water, Pixel sniffing the grass. The fluorescent stakes Nora had placed were back, untouched since the arrests. My cameras blinked steadily, their feeds quiet for now. Elliot called that evening with an update. Page had found a second bank account in Karen's name with another $5,000 from Chandler's consulting payments. "It's tightening around her," he said. I nodded, watching the creek ripple. The law was moving slow, but it was moving. And for the first time, I felt the tide turning in my favor. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the air thick with anticipation as the jury filed in. Months of legal battles had led to this moment, and I sat beside Elliot, my lawyer, gripping the edge of my seat. Karen Davis and Chandler, her accomplice, faced charges of felony conspiracy, theft, criminal mischief, and misdemeanor trespassing. The evidence was overwhelming, and Chandler's testimony had been the final nail in the coffin. Chandler, desperate to shave time off his looming prison sentence, had turned on Karen. He took the stand, his voice shaky but clear, and laid out her scheme. Karen had orchestrated the land grab, promising him a slice of my creekfront property once the HOA annexed it. In exchange, he'd forged documents, siphoned HOA funds, and did her dirty work under moonlight. The prosecutor played my Ring camera footage, the grainy video showing Chandler and Karen loading rebar into her SUV at 12:47 a.m., the timestamp aligning perfectly with the night Nora's survey stakes vanished. The jury watched, stone-faced, as Chandler's bolt cutters glinted and Karen's platinum blonde hair caught the light. Karen's lawyer, James Hall, tried to spin her as a misguided neighbor, but the evidence, bank records, forged receipts, and $13,000 funneled to her account painted a different picture. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning, guilty on all counts. The courtroom exhaled. Karen's bond was revoked, and the judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison, plus $32,000 in restitution to me, and $46,900 to the HOA. A 5-year no-contact order would keep her far from my land after release. Chandler, already facing 18 months for violating probation on his 2021 check-kiting conviction, took a plea for 4 years on the new charges with parole eligibility in 2. As Karen was led away, her face a mask of defiance, I caught her eye. I gave a small wave, not out of spite, but because it felt like closing a book. The creek, my bees, and Pixel were safe. The weight I'd carried for months lifted, leaving room for something new. Elliot clapped my shoulder as we left the courthouse. "You did good," he said. I nodded, the winter air sharp against my skin. The drive home was quiet, Pixel's head resting on my lap. The creek sparkled under the afternoon sun, its banks free of Karen's fence. I walked the boundary, checking Nora's fluorescent stakes still firmly in place. The cameras blinked steadily, their alerts silent for weeks now. That evening I sat on my porch, a beer in hand, and watched the sunset paint the sky orange. Pixel, fully healed, chased a butterfly through the grass. The beehives hummed with life again, their honey sweetening my coffee. I thought about the greenhouse I'd build come spring where Karen's gate once stood. Tomatoes, basil, maybe sunflowers, tall ones like the kind Chandler sketched in his apology letter from jail. The victory wasn't just the verdict. It was the creek flowing free, the bees thriving, and Pixel's tail wagging. It was knowing I'd fought for what was mine and won. As the stars emerged, I raised my bottle to the sky. Here's to new beginnings, I thought. The fire Karen sparked had burned out, and from its ashes I'd grow something better. The courtroom victory over Karen and Chandler was a milestone, but it didn't erase the scars left on my land or my psyche. The creek flowed freely again, but the memory of slashed fences, a smashed beehive, and Pixel's whimpered pain lingered. Spring arrived, painting the fields with wildflowers, and I knew it was time to rebuild not just my property but my sense of peace. The HOA, under a new board, sent a formal apology, a crisp letter tucked into my mailbox alongside a check for $4,500, recovered from Chandler's frozen accounts. It was enough to repair the beehives and replace the ruined frames, a small gesture that felt like a handshake across a mended fence. I started with the land where Karen's illegal gate once stood, a patch of earth that had been a battleground. I'd always dreamed of a greenhouse, a place to coax life from soil year-round. With the restitution money and some savings, I hired a local contractor, a quiet guy named Tom who nodded approvingly at my sketches. We broke ground in April, laying a foundation of reclaimed brick. By May, the greenhouse stood proud, glass panels gleaming, its frame sturdy against the wind. I filled it with tomato starts, basil, and rows of lettuce, their green tips pushing through the dirt. The air inside smelled of damp earth and possibility, a stark contrast to the mud and tire tracks of months past. Pixel, his paw long-heeled, took to the greenhouse like it was his kingdom. He'd sprawl in the sun-warmed dirt, tail thumping as I watered the plants. The bees, too, were thriving. The repaired hives buzzed with activity, and I harvested my first batch of honey since the vandalism, a golden jar I set on my kitchen counter like a trophy. I'd sip coffee by the creek, watching dragonflies dart and feel the land settling as if it too was exhaling. The HOA's new board was a breath of fresh air. Gone were the days of Chandler's forged receipts and Karen's rulebook thumping. The new president, Maria, a retired teacher with a knack for listening, invited me to a board meeting. "We want to make things right," she said, pouring me coffee. They'd implemented audits, hired an external accountant, and were drafting bylaws to prevent another Chandler-sized scam. Maria even asked for my input on a community garden project, a nod to my beehives and greenhouse. I declined a board seat. Paperwork wasn't my thing, but offered to share my honey at their next fundraiser. She smiled. Deal. The neighborhood began to feel like a community again. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to during the dispute stopped by with zucchini from their gardens or waved as they walked their dogs. One, a widower named Carl, brought me a cutting from his rose bush, a peace offering after he'd briefly sided with Karen's creek hazard nonsense. I planted it near the greenhouse, its pink blooms a reminder that not every bridge was burned. Elliot, my lawyer, called one afternoon with an update. Karen's restitution payments had started $58 a month, garnished from her prison wages. It'd take decades to cover the $32,000 she owed me, but the symbolism mattered. Chandler, still incarcerated, had sent another letter, this one with a detailed sketch of an orchard layout for my land. I didn't write back, but I kept the sketch, tucking it into a drawer. Maybe one day I'd plant those apple trees, if only to prove something could grow from ruin. By June, the greenhouse was bursting. I shared tomatoes with Maria and traded lettuce for Carl's homemade jam. Pixel bounded through the fields, chasing butterflies, his limp a distant memory. I'd walk the creek bank at dusk, checking Nora's fluorescent stakes, still untouched. The cameras, though still mounted, rarely pinged, mostly deer or the occasional raccoon. I left them up, a quiet reminder of the fight I'd won. As the sun set one evening, I sat on my porch, a jar of honey glowing amber in the light. The creek murmured and the bees hummed their steady song. This was my land, my home, reclaimed not just from Karen's schemes but from the anger that had simmered too long. The greenhouse stood as proof. Where there'd been destruction, I'd built something alive, and as Pixel curled up beside me, I knew we'd both earned this fresh start. A year after Karen's conviction, with the greenhouse thriving and the creek flowing free, I thought the saga was over. Then a letter arrived from Elaine Castor, claiming to be Karen's cousin and heir. She insisted Karen had granted her a private right-of-way across my land, citing a deed I'd never seen. My stomach sank. The document, emailed as a grainy PDF, screamed forgery, misaligned fonts, a notary seal that looked like it was drawn in crayon. I called Elliot, my lawyer, who laughed. "This is amateur hour," he said. "Give me a week." Elliot and I dug into the county records, pulling the original title and easement docs. Nora, the surveyor, confirmed the deed's coordinates didn't match my property. We sent Elaine a cease and desist, backed by Nora's affidavit and my camera footage of the creek bank, still pristine. Elaine withdrew her claim before the court date, her lawyer mumbling about a misunderstanding. I stood by the creek that evening, Pixel sniffing the grass, and felt the tension ease. The land was mine, and no forged paper could change that. Restitution checks started trickling in from the state's crime victim fund, Karen's prison wages garnished at $58 a month. It'd take decades to clear her $32,000 debt, but each deposit was a quiet victory. More surprising was a letter from Chandler, postmarked from prison. He'd earned a paralegal certificate and wrote a halting apology for the vandalism and fraud. Enclosed was a hand-drawn map suggesting spots for an orchard on my land. Apple and pear trees, he noted, would suit the soil. I stared at the sketch, its careful lines a contrast to the bolt cutters he'd once wielded. I wrote back no promises, but mentioned the sunflowers now towering near the greenhouse. "They're taller than you'd believe," I added. The creek sparkled under the autumn sun, its banks lined with Nora's fluorescent stakes, untouched since the trial. Pixel, fully healed, chased dragonflies, his tail a blur. The cameras blinked steadily, their alerts rare now, mostly deer or the wind rustling reeds. I kept them up, a silent guard. The HOA, reformed under Maria's leadership, sent a thank you for my honey at their fundraiser, a jar now gracing every board member's table. As I walked the boundary, I thought of Chandler's orchard sketch still in my drawer. Maybe I'd plant a tree not for him but for the land's resilience. The fight with Karen had been a fire, but from its ashes grew tomatoes, honey, and peace. Pixel nudged my hand and I smiled. The creek kept flowing, carrying the past away. This was full circle, not just a return but a step forward. By the next spring, the scars of Karen's land grab had faded, replaced by life bursting from the soil. Sprout Tomorrow, an organic farming nonprofit, bought Karen's foreclosed property, turning her manicured lawn into a canvas for change. They reached out, inviting me to consult on planting native pollinators to support my bees. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen's land, once a symbol of control, would now nurture the community she'd tried to bully. I agreed, arriving at their first volunteer day with my brush cutter and a grin. Deputy Rogers showed up, trading his badge for a shovel, alongside new HOA members and neighbors I'd only nodded to before. We worked under a cloudless sky, tearing out Corinne's ornamental shrubs to make way for raised beds and wildflower patches. Tomato vines and milkweed took root where her fence posts once stood. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the scent of fresh earth. Maria, the HOA president, handed me a seedling. "For your bees," she said. I planted it, patting the soil firm. The transformation was more than physical. It was therapeutic, a collective exhale after years of tension. Roger shared stories of quirky calls, and a neighbor, Carl, admitted he'd been wrong to back Corinne's creek hazard claims. "Live and learn," he said, passing me a water bottle. Pixel darted through the beds, tail wagging, as kids from Sprout Tomorrow tossed him a stick. The creek just beyond murmured its approval, its banks free and flourishing. Sprout Tomorrow's mission wasn't just about crops. It was about roots, literal and figurative. They planned workshops for local kids, teaching them to tend pollinators and harvest greens. My greenhouse, now a humming hub of tomatoes and basil, became a model. I shared tips on companion planting, and they gifted me a packet of sunflower seeds, a nod to the towering blooms I'd mentioned to Chandler. His orchard sketch still sat in my drawer, and I wondered if I'd plant that apple tree yet. As the day wound down, we stood back, sweaty and satisfied, surveying the beds. Corinne's former lawn was unrecognizable, alive, communal, hopeful. I leaned on my brush cutter, watching bees from my hives dance over the new milkweed. This was the final victory, not just winning in court, but turning a battleground into a garden. The land, once contested, now united us. That evening I walked the creek bank with Pixel, the sunset gilding the water. Nora's stakes glowed faintly and the cameras blinked, their vigilance no longer urgent. Corinne's shadow was gone, replaced by something better. I patted Pixel's head, his eyes bright. "We did all right," I said. The creek agreed, its ripples carrying the promise of more seasons, more growth, more peace. October's golden light bathed the creek as Sprout Tomorrow hosted their first harvest dinner on what was once Corinne's land. The nonprofit had transformed her sterile lawn into a vibrant community garden, and now tables groaned under the weight of its bounty. Roasted butternut squash, garlic honey carrots, and heirloom tomato bruschetta, all grown steps from my greenhouse. Neighbors mingled, their laughter rising above the clink of glasses, while kids darted through the raised beds, Pixel bounding after them with a playful bark. I leaned against a fence post, a jar of my honey glowing amber on the dessert table, and felt something settle deep within, a peace I hadn't known I'd been chasing. Maria, the HOA president, took the makeshift stage, a wooden pallet draped with wildflowers. She thanked Sprout Tomorrow, the volunteers, and to my surprise me. "For standing your ground," she said, raising a glass. Faces turned, some smiling, others nodding. Carl, the neighbor who'd once backed Corinne, gave me a sheepish thumbs up. I shrugged, deflecting the attention, but the warmth lingered. The real victory wasn't the applause, it was this. A community knitting itself back together, nourished by the land we'd fought over. The dinner was more than a meal, it was closure. Corinne's schemes, Chandler's fraud, the slashed fences, and Pixel's injury, they'd left marks, but those marks were fading. The creek flowed free, its banks lush with milkweed from Sprout Tomorrow's plantings. My bees, thriving in their rebuilt hives, pollinated the garden's blooms, their hum a quiet anthem of resilience. Even Elaine's forged deed, a final jab from Corinne's shadow, had crumbled under scrutiny. The restitution checks, $58 at a time, kept coming, each one a reminder that justice, however slow, was real. I'd built a barn that summer, using reclaimed wood from Corinne's old gate, now legitimately permitted through the county. Its beams stood sturdy, housing tools and dreams of an orchard. Maybe Chandler sketched apple trees, maybe not. The barn was a symbol, proof that destruction could be reshaped into something lasting. I'd painted its door red, a pop of color against the green fields, and Pixel loved napping in its shade, his tail thumping at every passing butterfly. As the dinner wound down, I helped stack chairs, swapping stories with Rogers, who traded his deputy's badge for a flannel shirt tonight. He chuckled about a recent call, a raccoon stuck in a mailbox, then grew serious. "You changed things here," he said, nodding toward the garden. "Made it better." I didn't know how to respond, so I just handed him a jar of honey. "For your coffee," I said. He grinned. Walking home with Pixel, the stars sharp overhead, I passed the creek bank. Nora's fluorescent stakes caught the moonlight, still untouched, and the cameras blinked, their feeds quiet. I'd keep them up a while longer, but their urgency had faded. The land felt like mine again, not just in title but in spirit. The greenhouse glowed faintly, its tomatoes and basil safe inside. The sunflowers, taller than ever, nodded in the breeze, their seeds a gift for next spring. Pixel nudged my hand, his eyes bright. We'd both healed, his paw my heart. The fight with Karen had been a storm, but it had cleared, leaving fertile ground. Sprout tomorrow's garden, the barn, the honey on every table. They were more than wins, they were promises kept. As I locked the gate, the creek's murmur seemed to agree. This was home, hard-won and whole. I patted Pixel's head. Onward, I said, and we headed inside, ready for whatever the seasons would bring.